October 2023 began as a blur, one day bleeding into the next. At 21, I was trying to balance a handful of temporary jobs, scraping by. Working the children's entertainment complex was just another gig, though this one had a twist. I had a knack for contortion, and for this event, I was to be the creepy contortionist in the maze. It was part of the haunted attraction, a maze darkened by flickering lights, twisting hallways, and false corners. I'd leap out from the shadows, twisting my body in disturbing shapes, my back arched and head contorted unnaturally. It was simple. Scare them, send them running, and reset for the next group. We weren't supposed to interact with the guests beyond scaring them. That was the rule. No touching, no matter how close they got. I'd heard plenty of stories about rowdy visitors, but it was my first season doing this kind of work, and I wasn't about to push any boundaries. At 6:30 p.m., just as the sun sank beneath the horizon, everyone headed to their positions for the night. The energy was familiar but charged, the kind that always comes just before the chaos of a long night. The maze was alive in its own way, with artificial fog rolling across the floor and dim lights flickering overhead, casting just enough shadow to make you feel like you were never quite alone. It was easy to get lost in the rhythm. Groups would come through, sometimes screaming before they even saw me. My contorted form would catch the corner of their eye, and they'd either scream or laugh. That was the cycle, all night long. But around 11:30 p.m., known as the witching hour by the staff, the crowd began to thin. The laughs were fewer, and the screams more forced as people grew tired. That's when I noticed something off. A man entered the maze, but unlike the usual guests who stumbled through in groups, this man was alone. He didn't have the air of someone there to have fun. His clothes were wrinkled, and his face carried a strange, vacant expression. As he walked closer, I could smell it, a faint, sour stench that stuck in the back of my throat. I performed my usual routine, twisting my body into unnatural shapes, making a sharp, jerking movement toward him. But instead of jumping back like most, he just stopped. His gaze locked onto mine, and he didn't flinch. His eyes were unblinking, almost too focused, as if he saw through me rather than at me. My heart began to race, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. Something was wrong. Trying to keep the act alive, I retreated into the shadows, hoping he'd move on like the rest. But he didn't. His steps grew slower, more deliberate, as he approached. My instincts told me to stay hidden, but a cold sweat had already started to form on the back of my neck. When he passed me, the smell of alcohol hit me hard. He was drunk, that much was clear. But it wasn't just the smell. It was the way he moved, erratic yet controlled. I watched him disappear around the next corner, his shadow swallowed by the maze's darkness. I could feel my breathing grow shallow as I stayed still, waiting for the next group to come through. But no one did. I stayed crouched for what felt like an eternity, the air growing heavier, until I heard the faint sound of footsteps again. This time it wasn't a group. The steps were slower, heavier, and they echoed off the narrow walls of the maze. A pit formed in my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but something was telling me to leave, to walk out of that maze and not look back. I knew the rules. No one was allowed to stay in the maze after their turn. You walk through, you get scared, and you leave. Yet here I was alone waiting. My throat tightened as the footsteps grew louder, and before I knew it, he was back. The same man, the same vacant look in his eyes, but this time he didn't walk past me. He stopped, standing still just a few feet away. The smell of sweat and alcohol clung to him like a cloud, and I realized he had been watching me the entire time. The dim light overhead flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the corner of the maze into darkness. I held my breath, waiting, praying he would just leave, but the silence stretched on. The air felt thick as I remained frozen in place, muscles tense, ready to bolt at the slightest movement. When the light flickered back on, he was gone. I didn't wait to see if he was coming back. I stepped out of the maze with my heart still pounding. The night's chill pressed against my sweat-drenched skin, but the cool air did little to calm the storm that raged inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the unsettling sense that something was off. I tried to brush it off as nothing more than the exhaustion of the night catching up to me. After all, it was late. The maze had a way of playing tricks on your mind, and I had been in there for hours. But the image of that man's blank, unflinching face stayed with me. I changed out of my costume in the staff room, slipping back into my regular clothes. The familiar noise of chatter from the other workers surrounded me. The usual post-shift banter about difficult guests and scares gone wrong. I forced myself to join in, trying to shake off the strange encounter. I didn't tell anyone about the man. It didn't feel right to mention him. Maybe I was just overreacting. By the time I stepped outside into the parking lot, most of the staff had already left. The maze and the rest of the entertainment complex looked completely different now. Empty, quiet, devoid of life. Only a few streetlights remained, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. I felt a prickle along my spine, a small voice in my head telling me to hurry up, to get to my car and leave. The parking lot was mostly empty, and my car sat at the far end, away from the others. As I approached it, the uneasy feeling grew. My hand hovered over the door handle, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of my eye, at the very edge of the parking lot near the tree line, a figure stood. At first, I thought it was one of the staff, maybe another actor lingering after the shift. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, my stomach sank. It was him, the man from the maze, standing there, his face barely visible in the shadows, but his posture unmistakable. My heart leapt into my throat, and I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the car. My fingers felt clumsy, shaking as I finally managed to hit the right button. I yanked the door open, practically throwing myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, I sat there breathing heavily, trying to convince myself it wasn't him, that I was just seeing things. The headlights of my car flicked on, illuminating the empty stretch of pavement in front of me. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes scanning the tree line where I'd seen him. He was gone. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Maybe it had been my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired, spooked from a long night of scares. I started the engine, the hum of the car comforting, grounding me in reality. But as I pulled out of the lot, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him again. The drive home was quiet, too quiet. The roads were deserted, and the faint glow of the city lights in the distance was the only reminder that I wasn't alone in the world. But even then, the feeling of being watched lingered. Every time I passed a shadowy street corner or saw movement out of the corner of my eye, my pulse spiked. When I finally reached my apartment, I parked and rushed inside, locking the door behind me with more force than necessary. My hands were still trembling as I leaned against the door, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. The rational part of me wanted to believe it had all been a coincidence. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I checked every window, pulled the curtains tight, and turned on every light in the apartment. I hated the darkness now, the way it crept in around the edges, filling every corner with unseen threats. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no way the man from the maze had followed me, no logical reason for him to be at the parking lot, let alone near my home. But logic didn't make the unease go away. The hours ticked by slowly. I paced the apartment, unable to sit still, my mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. Who was that man? Why hadn't he reacted like the others? Why had he been watching me so intently? And why did I feel like this wasn't over? Sometime after midnight, I finally managed to convince myself to lie down. Exhaustion was tugging at me, pulling me towards sleep even though my mind wouldn't stop racing. The bed felt cold, the sheets too thin, as if they couldn't protect me from the heavy silence pressing down on the apartment. I turned over, glancing at the window for what must have been the 100th time. That's when I saw it, just a faint shape, a shadow moving past the window, slow and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat, and I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was deadly silent, save for the sound of my own rapid breathing. I couldn't see anything outside now, but I knew that someone had been there. I sat in bed for hours after that, unable to sleep, too afraid to close my eyes. The man's face, his vacant, unblinking eyes, haunted my every thought. Something told me he wasn't finished yet. I barely slept that night. Every sound felt amplified. Every creak of the old apartment settling made me jolt awake. My heart pounded at the slightest noise, convinced it was him, waiting, watching. When I finally did drift off, the sleep was shallow, filled with disturbing images of dark, empty streets and unblinking eyes staring from the shadows. I woke up early, my body aching from the tension, feeling more exhausted than before I had gone to bed. I tried to go about my day normally, made coffee, tried to eat breakfast, but everything felt off. The morning sunlight filtering through the windows should have been comforting, but instead, it only highlighted how thin the glass was, how easy it would be for someone to just stand outside, watching. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me, even now in the daylight, and it was starting to wear on my nerves. I told myself I had to get out, clear my head. Staying cooped up in the apartment only fed into my paranoia. But where would I go? Work wasn't for another day, and the idea of going back to the maze after last night filled me with dread. I needed to feel normal again, but every place I thought of, every street, every shop, I could imagine him there. Finally, I settled on the park near my apartment. It was close, open, and full of people. The thought of being surrounded by others brought some small sense of comfort. I could blend in, disappear among the crowds. As I left my apartment and locked the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. My eyes darted across the street, scanning every shadow, every doorway, expecting to see him standing there, but there was nothing. Just the usual morning quiet. Still, I kept my pace brisk, my hands stuffed deep into my jacket pockets as if that would somehow make me feel safer. The park was as busy as ever, filled with joggers, parents pushing strollers, and kids running around. It should have been calming, but as I wandered through the park, I couldn't stop my eyes from scanning the crowd, looking for that familiar face, that unsettling stare. I walked aimlessly, my heart still racing despite the peaceful surroundings. The fear was irrational. I knew that, but it didn't matter. My gut told me something was wrong, and I couldn't ignore it. I found a bench near a cluster of trees and sat down, hoping the stillness would calm my nerves. For a moment, it did. The chatter of people around me blended into a soft hum, and I let myself close my eyes, taking deep, slow breaths. But then, the familiar smell hit me. That sour, pungent scent, so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. But as the breeze shifted, it grew stronger, unmistakable. My eyes shot open, and I looked around, my heart already hammering in my chest. There were people everywhere, but none of them looked out of place. None of them were him, but the smell lingered, stronger now, almost suffocating. It had to be him. He was here somewhere nearby, watching. I stood up, my legs shaky, and started walking, trying to act natural, trying not to draw attention. But I was panicking, my breaths coming in shallow gasps as I moved through the park. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there. I walked faster, my footsteps quickening, my eyes scanning the crowd, the trees, anywhere he could be hiding. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The crowds that had once brought me comfort now felt like a threat. There were too many people, too many places for him to hide. I just needed to get out, get somewhere safe, anywhere that wasn't here. By the time I reached the edge of the park, my pulse was racing, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I turned onto a side street, away from the park, hoping the quiet would calm me down. But it didn't. The feeling of being followed had returned in full force, stronger now than ever. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him walking just behind me. The street was empty, nothing but the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. But the smell lingered, faint but constant, like a warning that he was close. I hurried my pace, not caring where I was going anymore, just trying to put as much distance between myself and that park as possible. Every few steps, I would glance behind me, my nerves frayed, but there was never anyone there. When I finally stopped, I found myself at a small, rundown diner on the edge of town. The kind of place you only go when there's nowhere else to be. I stepped inside, the smell of stale coffee and greasy food hitting me hard, but it was better than the alternative. The place was mostly empty, just a couple of regulars scattered across the tables. I found a booth in the back, away from the windows, and sat down. The waitress didn't even look up as she slid a menu toward me. I didn't plan on eating, but being here made me feel hidden, like I was off the radar, at least for a little while. I sat there, staring blankly at the menu, my hands still trembling as I tried to make sense of everything. How had things spiraled out of control so quickly? I kept glancing at the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for him to walk in. But the door never moved. The diner stayed as quiet and still as it had been when I arrived. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, it never left. I sat in the diner for what felt like hours. The cup of coffee I'd ordered sat untouched in front of me, going cold. I wasn't really here. Not mentally. My mind kept drifting. Back to the maze. Back to that man's eyes locked on mine. Back to the feeling of his presence in the parking lot. The sense that I wasn't alone hadn't left me. It was suffocating, clinging to me like a second skin. Every time the door to the diner opened, I tensed, half expecting him to walk in, to sit across from me without saying a word. I couldn't live like this, in this constant state of fear and paranoia. But the more I tried to shake it, the deeper it sank its claws into me. There was no logic to this, no reason for him to have followed me here, but logic wasn't what I was running on anymore. It was pure survival instinct, and right now, every instinct I had was screaming that I wasn't safe. At some point, I realized I couldn't stay in the diner forever. I needed to move, to go somewhere, anywhere. But going home felt too risky. What if he followed me again? What if he was waiting for me outside, just like before? My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my phone, unsure of what to do. I could call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? I hadn't told anyone about what happened in the maze. I hadn't even told my coworkers. And now, it would sound insane. No, I couldn't involve anyone else. I just have to keep moving, stay on the streets, stay visible. He wouldn't do anything if I was in public. He couldn't. With that thought in mind, I left some money on the table and walked out into the afternoon sun. The day was bright and clear, the kind of day that felt at odds with the darkness swirling inside me. I stuck to the busier streets, blending in with the midday crowds, always keeping my eyes moving. I still didn't see him, but the smell, the faint, sour stench that clung to my memory, kept haunting me, following me like a phantom. I wandered aimlessly, without any real destination. Every time I thought about turning back toward my apartment, a fresh wave of anxiety washed over me. I wasn't ready to go back. Not yet, but I couldn't keep walking forever. Eventually, I found myself in front of an old movie theater, one of those rundown places that showed films that had long since left the main cinemas. I bought a ticket without really thinking, more for the promise of sitting in a dark room where no one would see me than for the movie itself. The theater was nearly empty when I stepped inside. Just a couple of other people scattered throughout the seats. I chose one near the back where I could see the entire room and, more importantly, the door. I slumped down in the seat, letting the cool darkness of the theater wash over me. The movie started, some old black and white film I didn't recognize, but I wasn't really paying attention. My eyes kept flicking to the entrance, my ears straining for the faintest sound of the door creaking open. It was quiet for a long time, too quiet. Then, as the film played on, I smelled it again. That same sour stench, faint but unmistakable. My body stiffened. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened, waiting for something, anything. The seconds stretched on, and then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow at the far edge of the theater, near the door. My pulse quickened, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't turn my head to look. I couldn't. Instead, I stared straight ahead at the screen, the images blurring together as my vision narrowed, my senses going into overdrive. The smell grew stronger. He was getting closer. I could feel it. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, trapping me in place. I forced myself to breathe, slow and shallow, my fingers gripping the armrests of the seat so hard they hurt. I needed to move, to get up and leave, but every muscle in my body had locked up, frozen with fear. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there. I could feel his presence, that suffocating sensation of being watched. It was like he was waiting, biding his time. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I couldn't tell. I was too focused on trying to stay calm, on keeping my breathing steady. But every second felt like an eternity. And then, suddenly, the smell began to fade. Slowly, it drifted away, and with it, the overwhelming sense of his presence. It was only then that I dared to glance toward the door. It was still closed, no sign of anyone standing there, no shadow lingering in the dark. But the smell, it had been real. I hadn't imagined it. I stood up, my legs shaky, and made my way to the exit, trying not to draw attention to myself. I kept my eyes down, focused on the floor, and pushed through the doors into the blinding sunlight outside. The sudden brightness made me wince, but I didn't stop walking. I needed to keep moving to stay ahead of whatever was following me. As I stepped onto the street, I realized something chilling. It wasn't just my imagination. He was real, and he wasn't going to stop. This wasn't over. Not even close. I didn't know where to go next. Every step I took felt like a desperate attempt to outrun the growing sense of dread that clung to me. My pulse still raced as I made my way down the street, trying to disappear into the busy afternoon crowd. The theater hadn't helped, and now I was more sure than ever that the man wasn't just in my head. He was real, and I had no idea why he was following me. I wandered for a while longer, trying to stay calm, but my thoughts were scattered, chaotic. I kept imagining him just a few steps behind me, hidden in every shadow, watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, as if I were prey, and he was just waiting for the right moment to strike. Eventually, I found myself at a small park near the outskirts of town. It was quieter here, with only a few people walking their dogs or sitting on benches. The peaceful setting felt out of place, almost surreal, given how tightly wounded I was inside. I sat down on an empty bench, trying to catch my breath. The cool breeze rustled the leaves, but instead of feeling calming, it felt like the air was heavy, pressing down on me. I kept glancing around, looking for any sign of him, but there was nothing. No shadowy figure lurking by the trees, no eerie presence hovering just out of sight. For a brief moment, I wondered if maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the lack of sleep, the long shifts in the maze, and the general stress of life had finally gotten to me. Maybe my mind was playing tricks, but deep down I knew better. The smell, the way it clung to the air, unmistakable, wasn't something I could imagine. And that look in his eyes, the way he had focused on me in the maze, that was real. Too real. He wasn't just some random guest. He had come for a reason, though I still couldn't understand why. As I sat there, staring out at the park, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a notification from work, a reminder about my next shift. I had almost forgotten that I was supposed to go back tonight. The thought of returning to the maze, of stepping back into that dark, twisting labyrinth, made my stomach twist with anxiety. How could I possibly go back there, knowing what had happened? But then, as much as I dreaded it, I also felt a strange pull. The maze was where this had all started. Maybe going back was the only way to make sense of what was happening. Maybe, just maybe, if I confronted whatever was going on, I could find a way to end this. Reluctantly, I made up my mind. I was going back to work. The hours passed slowly as I waited for my shift to begin. My nerves were on edge the entire time, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was waiting for me. I kept pacing around my apartment, glancing at the windows, checking the locks on the doors, but there was no sign of him. No shadow in the corner, no lingering smell. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I had gotten away. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. When it was finally time to leave for work, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I grabbed my things, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the night. The air was cool, the streets mostly quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. The further I walked, the darker it became. By the time I reached the complex, the sky was pitch black, and the familiar glow of the haunted attraction's lights greeted me in the distance. I stopped outside the entrance for a moment, staring at the maze from the outside. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to keep moving. I'd do this. As I changed into my costume and took my place in the maze, everything felt eerily normal. The staff chatted about their day. and the familiar sounds of the attraction filled the air. Screams, laughter, the shuffle of feet as people moved through the dark corridors. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. I scared a few groups, contorted myself into strange shapes, and did my job just like any other night. But then, around the same time as the night before, the familiar unease began to creep back in. The air felt heavy again, like something was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I hadn't seen him yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. The anticipation of it was almost worse than the encounter itself. And then, as I crouched in my usual spot, waiting for the next group to pass, the smell hit me. Sour, sharp, unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I was frozen in place. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone moving with purpose. It was him. He walked through the maze, alone again, just like the night before. But this time he didn't walk past me. This time he stopped, standing only a few feet away, his face hidden in the dim light. I could see his outline, the same rumpled clothes, the same unsettling posture. He stood there motionless, just staring at me, as if waiting for me to make the first move. My pulse raced, every instinct telling me to run, to get out. But I couldn't move. I was locked in place, staring at him, my chest tightening as the silence stretched on. And then, without a word, he took a step forward. My body locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as he took that single step forward. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. His face was still mostly in shadow, but I could see the faintest hint of a smile pulling at the corners of his lips, as though he knew exactly what he was doing, unraveling me bit by bit. For a moment, I thought about running, just bolting out of the maze and never looking back. But my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if my body had shut down, paralyzed by fear. The maze, once just a job, had now become something darker, something that twisted and distorted reality. Every flickering light, every shadow, felt alive, closing in around me. He took another step closer, his movements slow, deliberate. My chest tightened. It wasn't just his presence that terrified me. It was the way he moved, like he had all the time in the world. Like he knew I wasn't going anywhere. The smell hit me again, stronger this time, sour and suffocating. It made me want to gag, to get as far away from him as possible. But my body still refused to cooperate. The world felt like it was closing in on me, the walls of the maze shrinking with every second that passed. And then, without warning, he stopped. Just a few feet away, close enough that I could see his eyes now. Those same cold, unblinking eyes that had watched me the night before. He tilted his head slightly, as though studying me, waiting for something. The flickering light overhead cast eerie shadows on his face, distorting his features even more. I forced myself to breathe, my chest heaving as I struggled to maintain control. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. I couldn't let him know how terrified I was. I couldn't let him win. And then he did something I wasn't expecting. He turned and walked away. Just like that, as if the encounter had been nothing more than a game to him. He disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the darkness of the maze. I stood there, frozen, my body still trembling from the encounter. For a moment, I couldn't believe he was gone. I half expected him to come back, to reappear from the shadows and finish whatever twisted game he had started. But he didn't. Slowly, my body started to come back to life. My legs felt weak, my heart still hammering in my chest, but I could move again. I stumbled out of my hiding spot, leaning against the wall for support, trying to catch my breath. My head spun, the world tilting around me as I fought to make sense of what had just happened. Why had he come back? Why had he stopped? And most importantly, what did he want from me? I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in the maze any longer. Not after that. I pushed myself to my feet, the trembling in my legs making every step feel like I was walking through quicksand. The maze felt endless now, its twists and turns disorienting me, making it hard to focus. Every shadow seemed darker, every flickering light more menacing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the exit. The night air hit me like a slap to the face, cold and crisp. I stumbled out, nearly tripping over my own feet as I rushed toward the staff area. I felt sick, my stomach churning with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. As I entered the staff room, I noticed a few of the other actors sitting around, chatting and laughing. They hadn't noticed anything. They didn't know what had just happened in the maze. I thought about telling them, about warning them that something wasn't right, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain it? How could I make them believe me? Instead, I changed out of my costume in silence, my hands still shaking as I fumbled with the buttons. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together, but nothing made sense. The man, whoever he was, hadn't just been a random visitor. He had followed me, watched me, and now he had returned. Why? I left the complex without saying a word to anyone. The walk to my car felt like a blur, every sound, every shadow making me jump. By the time I reached my car, my nerves were completely shot. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I had to figure out what was happening. I couldn't live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to show up again. But how? Where would I even begin? As I drove home, my mind raced through the events of the past 2 nights, trying to find some kind of pattern, some clue that would explain why this was happening to me. But the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. There was no logical reason for any of this. None of it made sense. I pulled into my apartment complex and parked, but I didn't get out right away. My eyes scanned the parking lot, looking for any sign of him. But it was empty, just rows of parked cars and the distant hum of traffic. Still, the unease didn't leave me. I grabbed my phone and opened a search engine, typing in keywords, stalking, strange behavior, haunted attractions, anything that might give me an explanation. But as I scrolled through articles, news stories, and old forum posts, I came across something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just me. Other people had seen him too. My stomach dropped as I stared at the screen. The articles and forum posts in front of me were scattered, some old, some recent, but they all had one thing in common. People were talking about him. I scrolled through the posts quickly, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of it all. Different cities, different years, but the descriptions, they matched him exactly. A man, always alone, always following. The stories varied. Some said he appeared at night. Others said he watched them during the day, but the core details were the same. The same unsettling gaze. The same quiet presence. And always the smell. I clicked on a forum post that had been updated just a few weeks ago. The poster described working a late shift at a theme park, noticing a man who kept coming back night after night. The man didn't do anything overtly threatening. He just stood there, watching. Sometimes he got closer, but never touched, never spoke. The poster had tried to ignore him, thinking it was just a weird coincidence, but the encounters grew stranger. They described the same sour, rancid smell that followed the man wherever he went. And then, one day, the man disappeared. The forum post ended abruptly, no explanation, no follow-up. The last comment was from someone asking if the poster was okay, but there was no response. A cold dread settled in my chest as I scrolled through similar stories, each one a little different, but all eerily familiar. It wasn't just happening to me. This man, whoever he was, had been following people for years. I leaned back in my car seat, the phone still glowing in my lap. As the reality of the situation sank in, my breath came in shallow gasps. This wasn't just some random guy. He had done this before, and I was just the latest person on his list. But why? What did he want? No one in the story seemed to know. The man would appear, watch them, and then vanish without a trace. Some people mentioned trying to confront him, but it never worked. He always slipped away. And now he was here in my life. A wave of nausea washed over me. I couldn't just sit here and let this happen. I had to do something. I had to figure out how to stop him before it got worse. But how? The police? Would they even believe me? What would I say? Hi, a creepy guy is following me, but he hasn't actually done anything illegal yet. No, they'd think I was paranoid, that I was imagining things. I needed proof. Something concrete. If he came back, if I could somehow catch him on camera or record him, then maybe they'd take me seriously. With a shaky breath, I started the car and drove home, my mind racing with what to do next. I couldn't just hide forever, waiting for him to make his next move. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more times than I could count, half expecting to see him following me, but the roads were empty. Still, the tension in my body never left. When I finally pulled into my apartment parking lot, the unease was still gnawing at me. I parked as close to the entrance as I could and practically ran to the door, my keys jangling in my hand as I fumbled to unlock it. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, checking it twice just to be sure. I went to each window, pulling the curtains tight, making sure there were no gaps. The apartment felt claustrophobic, but at least in here I could control the space. I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, wondering if I should call someone. But who? I didn't have anyone nearby who would understand. My family lived in another state, and even if I told them, what could they do? No, I was on my own. I had to figure this out myself. My mind wouldn't stop racing. I grabbed my laptop and opened it, still determined to find something. Anything that would explain this. I went back to the forum, reading more posts, but they all ended the same way. Confusion, fear, and then silence. None of the stories gave me any answers. There were no clear patterns, no clues as to why this man targeted certain people. It was as if he chose them at random, followed them for a while, and then vanished. I kept scrolling, desperate for some kind of breakthrough, when I came across a new post that caught my eye. It was a long thread titled, "Has anyone else seen him again?" I clicked on it. The poster described an encounter that sounded eerily similar to mine. They had worked at a haunted house attraction, much like the maze, and had noticed a man watching them. He had shown up multiple nights, always staying just long enough to make them feel uneasy before disappearing. But what sent a chill down my spine was the last part of the post. The poster wrote that, after months of nothing, the man had returned. Not just in public places, but at their home. He stood outside their window at night, watching them while they slept. The poster had tried everything, locking doors, calling the police, even moving to a new place, but the man always found them. And then, just like in the other stories, the post stopped. No updates, no resolution, just silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen. Was that what was coming for me? Would he come to my apartment next, standing outside in the dark, waiting for me to notice him? Would he follow me forever, never saying a word, just watching? And would I ever escape him? I closed the laptop and buried my face in my hands, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like no matter where I went, he would be there. And now, knowing that others had seen him too, that he had followed them even to their homes, made the fear so much worse. I couldn't escape him. Not yet. The apartment was silent, but my mind raced, replaying everything I had read, everything I had experienced. I couldn't escape the creeping realization that this man, whoever he was not just some random stalker. He was something more deliberate, more relentless. Every story I had read ended with the same helpless silence. The posters disappearing from the conversation like they had vanished from their own lives. And now I was on that same path. The idea of him standing outside my window made my skin crawl. I found myself glancing over at the curtains, half expecting to see his silhouette pressed against the glass, watching me through the thin fabric. But it wasn't just fear that gripped me. It was the certainty that this wasn't going to end until he had what he wanted, though what that was I had no idea. I couldn't just sit here and wait for him to make his next move. I had to do something, anything. With a shaky breath, I stood up and began pacing around the room. My pulse raced, the anxiety building in my chest with every step. What was I supposed to do now? The forum had only made things worse. It confirmed that I wasn't imagining things, but it also left me with no real answers. No one had stopped him. No one even seemed to know how. I reached for my phone again, my fingers hovering over the search bar. Maybe there was something I had missed, some clue, some connection that would help me make sense of all this. But then a notification popped up on my screen, an email from work. It was a reminder of my next shift at the maze. I stared at it, a wave of nausea hitting me. The idea of going back to that place, of stepping into the maze again, made my stomach churn. But I couldn't just ignore it. If I didn't show up, people would notice. They might start asking questions, and I wasn't ready to explain any of this. Not yet. I typed out a quick reply, confirming that I'd be there, and hit send before I could change my mind. Then, I collapsed back onto the couch, my hands gripping the fabric tightly. My heart was pounding. Going back to work was the last thing I wanted to do, but I didn't have a choice. I had to keep up the appearance that everything was fine, that I wasn't falling apart at the seams. The hours leading up to my shift dragged by slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. My nerves were on edge, my mind cycling through 1,000 different scenarios of what could happen. What if he showed up again? What if this time we didn't just stand there watching? What if he did something? By the time I left for work, my entire body was trembling. The walk to the complex felt surreal, like I was moving through a fog, everything around me blurred and distant. The familiar sights of the town, the streets I had walked so many times before, felt foreign now, tainted by the growing fear that he was somewhere close, lurking just out of sight. When I arrived at the complex, everything looked the same as it always had. The bright lights, the noise of families milling about, the usual chaos of a busy night. But to me, it felt like stepping into a nightmare. The maze loomed in the distance, a dark, twisting labyrinth that seemed to swallow the light. I changed into my costume in silence, avoiding eye contact with the other actors. They didn't seem to notice how on edge I was, too caught up in their own preparations for the night. Part of me wanted to tell someone, to warn them, but what would I even say? How could I explain something I barely understood myself? The night started off quietly enough. The usual groups of guests shuffled through the maze, their laughter and screams blending into a background noise that I barely registered. I went through the motions, contorting myself into my usual grotesque positions, but my mind was elsewhere. I was waiting for him. I knew he would come, and sure enough, he did. It was almost exactly the same as before. I smelled him before I saw him, that sour, rotting stench that clung to the air like a thick fog. My chest tightened, and I crouched lower, my body tensing in anticipation. The footsteps echoed softly through the narrow corridors of the maze, slow and deliberate, like he was taking his time, savoring the moment. When he finally appeared, he was exactly where I expected him to be, just a few feet away, standing still, his face partially obscured by shadow. But this time, he didn't stop. He kept walking, his eyes never leaving me, his expression cold and unreadable. My pulse quickened, panic rising in my chest as he came closer and closer. I tried to move, to back away, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. It was like I was trapped, frozen in place by some invisible force. He stepped into the faint glow of a nearby light, his face fully illuminated now. He was smiling. A small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was there, and it sent a wave of terror through me like nothing I had ever felt before. My breath caught in my throat as he reached out, his hand stretching toward me, the smile never leaving his face. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away, but my body refused to cooperate. The air around me felt suffocating, thick and heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. His hand was so close now, just inches away, and still I couldn't move. And then, just as his fingers brushed against my costume, something strange happened. He stopped. His hand hovered there for a moment, trembling slightly, before he pulled back. The smile faded from his face, replaced by something darker, something colder. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the maze once again, leaving me standing there, shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. He was playing with me, and the game wasn't over. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my legs weak beneath me, the sensation of his cold, near touch still lingering on my skin. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, but my mind couldn't catch up with my body. I was frozen in place, my heart still racing from the fear that had gripped me just moments ago. He was gone again, but it felt different this time. He hadn't just appeared and disappeared like before. No, this time he had come closer, much closer. He had reached for me, and for a second, I thought he was going to... I couldn't even finish the thought. A wave of nausea rolled through me, and I stumbled out of my hiding spot, barely managing to keep my balance. My costume felt too tight, too constricting, as if it were suffocating me, but I couldn't tear it off here. Not yet. I needed to get out of the maze. I moved quickly, my footsteps echoing through the narrow corridors as I made my way toward the exit. The night felt thick around me, the dim lights of the maze flickering in and out, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me. Every corner felt like a trap, every twist and turn like a potential ambush. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain that I would see him again, that he was just waiting to strike when I least expected it. But the maze was empty. By the time I reached the exit, my hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I could barely keep it together. I slipped out of the maze and into the staff area, my breath still coming in harsh gasps. I needed to calm down. I needed to think clearly, but my mind was still reeling from what had just happened. I felt like I was unraveling, piece by piece. The other actors were still inside, lost in their own world of fake screams and carefully orchestrated scares, completely unaware of what was happening to me. To them, it was just another night at the maze. For me, it was becoming something much darker, something I couldn't escape. I hurried to the staff room and peeled off the costume as quickly as I could, the fabric clinging to my sweat-drenched skin. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like the costume had been a shield, however flimsy, between me and the reality of the situation. Now that it was gone, I felt naked, defenseless. I grabbed my bag and rushed out of the building, not bothering to say goodbye to anyone. They wouldn't understand. How could they? I barely understood it myself. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. I couldn't be in that maze, not with him lurking somewhere in the shadows, playing his twisted game. The night air hit me like a slap to the face, cold and biting. I walked quickly to my car, my pulse still racing, my eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of him. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, every corner darker, every movement suspicious. But I saw nothing. He wasn't there, at least not that I could see. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to collect myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. My hands were trembling as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. I drove out of the parking lot, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his face in the back seat. The drive home was a blur. My mind kept replaying the moment he had reached for me, the way his hand had hovered in the air, so close yet somehow distant. Why had he stopped? Why hadn't he touched me? And what did that cold, dark look in his eyes mean? It was as if he had made a decision, but I didn't know what it was, and the uncertainty of it terrified me. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt completely drained, physically and mentally. But there was no relief in being home. If anything, the fear intensified as I parked my car and approached the entrance to my building. He had followed me here before. What if he was waiting for me now? I hurried inside, checking over my shoulder constantly, but the street was empty. I locked the door behind me, checking it twice, then 3 times before pulling all the curtains closed. The apartment felt stifling, but at least here I was hidden from the outside world. But that didn't stop the dread from gnawing at me. I dropped onto the couch, my body trembling, and stared at the phone in my hand. I needed to do something. I couldn't keep going like this, living in constant fear, waiting for him to show up again. I needed answers. I needed to figure out what he wanted, why he was targeting me. I opened my phone and went back to the forum, hoping there was something, anything, that I had missed. I scrolled through the posts, my eyes scanning for new updates, new clues. But there was nothing, just more silence, more people who had vanished without explanation. And then a notification popped up. It was an email. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, half expecting it to be from work, or worse, something from him. But it wasn't. The subject line read, "I know what you're going through." A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the screen. The sender was anonymous, the email address untraceable. I hesitated for a moment, my hand shaking, before I opened the message. It was short, just a few words. "He doesn't stop. He never stops." The email stared back at me, the words blurring together as my heart pounded in my chest. He doesn't stop. He never stops. The cold, stark finality of that sentence sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Whoever had sent this knew exactly what I was going through, knew the fear that had been building inside me. The constant pressure of being watched, followed, hunted. I read the email over and over, trying to find some hidden meaning, some clue that would give me more than just those haunting words. But there was nothing else. No explanation. No advice. Just a warning. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, the light from my phone casting long shadows in the darkened apartment. I felt the weight of the silence around me pressing in, the stillness of the night outside, making it feel as though the world had stopped. What did this mean? Was this person another victim? Or someone who had survived longer than the others, sending out warnings from the shadows, trying to help? I needed more information. I needed to know who had sent this email, but there was no name, no address I could trace. The message had come from nowhere, and yet it felt so personal, so direct. As if the stranger had been watching my every move, had known what I was going through better than I did. For a long moment, I just sat there, my mind racing, unsure of what to do next. Should I reply? Ask for help? Ask what to do to escape this nightmare? But a gnawing fear told me that whoever had sent this wouldn't have the answers I was looking for. If they did, they wouldn't have sent that final sentence, "He doesn't stop." I closed the email, but the sense of dread lingered, like a heavy fog that wouldn't lift. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on me, the darkness in the corners deepening, thickening. I kept expecting to see his face, his smile, lurking just outside the window or standing in the shadows of the hallway. Every creak, every soft sound in the building made me jump, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. I felt trapped, like a caged animal waiting for the predator to strike. The apartment wasn't safe. Nowhere was safe. Not while he was out there, watching, waiting. The email was proof that I wasn't imagining it, that I wasn't alone in this twisted game. But it also confirmed my worst fear. There was no way out. Unless I made one. The thought hit me hard, jolting me into motion. I grabbed a bag and started throwing things into it, clothes, my phone charger, a few essentials. I didn't have a plan yet, but I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I had to do something. If I stayed, he'd come for me. It was only a matter of time. As I packed, my hands trembling, my mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. Where could I go? Could I outrun him? What if he found me no matter where I went? The fear gnawed at me, but I couldn't give in to it. I had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of him, even if I didn't know how far he'd go. I zipped up the bag and threw it over my shoulder, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated for a moment, standing in the middle of the apartment, taking in the last few moments of familiarity. I had lived here for 2 years. It had been a safe space, a refuge from the world outside. But now it felt like a trap, the walls too thin, the windows too exposed. With one final glance at the apartment, I left, locking the door behind me, though I knew it wouldn't keep him out. The hallways of the building were dark, too quiet. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud as I made my way down the stairs, each creak and groan of the old building sending a jolt of anxiety through me. By the time I reached my car, I was practically shaking. The night air was cool, but it did nothing to calm me. I got into the car and locked the doors immediately, checking the back seat out of pure instinct, though I knew he wouldn't be there. Still, the paranoia was too strong to ignore. I started the engine, the familiar hum of the car offering some small comfort, and pulled out of the parking lot. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to drive. As I navigated the quiet streets, my mind whirled with questions. Who had sent that email? How did they know? And more importantly, where was he? Was he watching me now, following me from a distance? Or was he waiting for the right moment to strike again? I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, the streets empty and dark, the city growing more distant with every mile I put behind me. But no matter how far I drove, the fear didn't leave. It stayed with me, gnawing at my insides, whispering that no matter where I went, he would find me. Finally, I pulled over at a gas station on the outskirts of town. The place was deserted, the neon lights flickering overhead, casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. I sat there for a moment, staring out at the empty pumps, trying to decide what to do next. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the lot, just barely visible in the flickering light. My heart stopped. It was him. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him. That same stillness, that same unnerving presence. He was waiting. He had followed me. Hey there. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank all of you.